Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webcast from NetSurian and Cyber Defenses on dark web intelligence beyond compromised credentials. Before I hand over to our presenters, Monty St. John and Guy Cunningham, I want to run through a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared within the next few days. Please keep an eye out for an email and a link to view the on-demand version. During the webinar, if any questions come up, please enter them in the toolbar. We'll be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and our presenters will answer as many as they can during the presentation. At the end of our webinar, we have an exciting offer, with Cyber Defenses offering free deep insights reports for 5 registrants. We'll cover the details at the end of the webinar and run a post-show drawing for winners. Now, I would like to quickly present our agenda and then introduce our speakers. Today's speakers are Guy Cunningham and Monty St. John. Guy Cunningham from NetSurian has more than 20 years of experience as a leader in the information technology market. Driven to win and with a track record of building new strategic relationships, Guy is focused on sales and partner enablement. Monty St. John joins us from Cyber Defenses and has 30 years of security, investigation, and analytics expertise. That includes physical investigation, as well as information security, computer forensics, reverse engineering, and cyber threat intelligence. He is a Navy and Air Force veteran with 2 decades supporting federal, state, and local law enforcement while in uniform. From here, I'm going to pass on the microphone to today's presenters.
Great, thanks, Graham. This is Guy Cunningham with NetSurian. We really appreciate your attendance today. Hopefully you'll get a lot of value out of today's topic. I know that every time that I talk with Monty, it's an educational experience to say the least. It makes me appreciate the experience that he has and the expertise that he brings to the table and the opportunity that we have to work with Cyber Defenses. Before we get started with the content, just a quick introduction on who NetSurian is. Most of you probably know who NetSurian is, but we are focused on powering secure and agile networks for medium enterprise customers, and with a special focus on the IT partners that serve those types of customers. We offer both a branch network management solution built around an SD-WAN platform, and we offer threat detection and response solutions built around our proprietary SIM platform, which is a real close corollary to what we're going to talk about today. Our SIM software and services offer advanced threat protection and operate as the center, the hub of our security operations center, which provides our customers with a 24/7 monitoring and response solution. Turn it over to Monty real quick for his description about what Cyber Defenses does.
Thank you, Guy, for your kind words earlier. I feel the same way. Cyber Defenses is a company that's headquartered here in Austin, Texas. We've been around since 2001, founded by a group of military veterans that had responded to events at the Pentagon in 2001. We carried forward and continued the company since then all the way to this year. And many of us are still retired military or retired Department of State, Department of Defense. We work in multiple sectors, many partnerships with MSPs and SSPs, as well as assist various states and localities in dealing with issues at municipalities and at state levels. Put it back in your hands, Guy.
Great, thanks, Monty. So, Monty, before we get started, I want to try and lay a foundation for what I believe is the perception that many of our attendees are going to have. Those perceptions are about cyber threats, the threat intelligence that's available to us today, and then the dark web. And what we've been told from a bunch of the vendors in this space is that data theft and ransomware are the 2 biggest threats facing us today in 2020. And that applies to whether you're talking a large enterprise or a small and medium-sized business. Because of budgets, I believe, and the decision makers' experience with cybersecurity. Most small businesses think that ransomware is their biggest threat, and they feel like they're not really at risk for data theft. So if we can get into that at some point, I think that'd be interesting. But I feel like most of the vendors serving the SMB, the SME space are talking mostly about ransomware. And then regarding threat intelligence, there's a lot of threat intelligence vendors out there, and it's used in a whole bunch of different ways, but I don't think that it's broadly well understood. Now we know that there's a whole bunch of vendors offering it, but we don't know how valuable it is. We don't know if there's, one is more valuable than the other, or how we can derive value from those threat intelligence sources. And then finally, the dark web. We hear a lot about it, but honestly, I don't think many of us really know what it is or what's going on out there, other than, people are buying and selling stolen passwords and credentials. So with that kind of baseline in mind, I'm really excited to work through these challenges on today's webinar and to dive into these topics a little bit deeper. So, Monty, I'd like your assessment of what drives an attacker, what motivates an attacker, and then compare and contrast that to what their interest is, the difference between motivation and interest.
Sure, Guy. Happy to talk about that. In fact, when speaking of motivation, when I think of motivation, and what typically we talk about when we, as analysts, discuss the motivation of an attacker or an attacker group, we're really talking about what drives them, whether it's financial, if they're a hacktivist or nation state, and we'll give them labels to help make that a little easier to digest. But really, it's a very big picture that we're trying to convey that is kind of an uneven fit to explain why that particular attacker might be focused on you. It might be focused on a company or a client of yours. And so this is where we bring in interest and why it's a little different. Interest is what really describes what the attacker values. It's different from what you value, but it's just as important. It kind of helps us evaluate the amount of buy-in and stickiness of that attacker to a target. Will they stay on target or will they not? A lot of that is driven by how much interest they have in you and pursuing you in case you make it difficult for them. So in fact, that leads me into this point that I think is important to say, guys, that when you counter interest, you counter their momentum by making it really difficult for them to meet any of their objectives. And that could be done in a lot of different ways. Mostly it's making yourself less valuable, right? Making it harder for them to strike you successfully. So a lot of that is in your responses to like their attacks and, even controlling the amount of data they have readily at their disposal. As you can imagine, of the two, interest is kind of more value to us as it kind of demonstrates what and who attackers will invest in when they're out there performing their side of the business. A lot of times we gauge it out of reconnaissance and how much effort they put into the setup to perform an attack. So guys, it's a great discussion topic that I could dig into forever.
Well, that's great. As we've been talking about and preparing for this presentation, you've talked a lot about how to index that interest so that an organization can have an indicator that there might be something coming up, that they are a potential target. Would you mind explaining that a little bit further?
Sure, happy to do so, Guy. There's phases to an attack. If you look at things operationally, no matter how disorganized our attacker is as a group or an individual, they go through phases, and everybody goes through the same phases. There's a planning phase, to speak generally. There's a reconnaissance phase that kind of comes next, where they understand their target more. And then there's a build-up phase where they acquire assets and grab different means in order to perform their attack. And then they move into operational steps. It's completely different from things you might have heard of, like a kill chain or something like that. They're cousins, but this is speaking at a kind of high level and conceptual chunks on what phases they have to flow through. And it is circular. It's not a waterfall. They're not going to flow from planning all the way to operational in one path. They're actually going to fall back and restart several times. So when we look at the index of things, we talk about how you can kind of gauge that interest. When you can't really see attacker planning from the outside. You can only get hints about what they did and what they put together from the build phase and reconnaissance phase of those operational steps. So when they go into reconnaissance mode to gather information on you, to understand you as a target, that's when they tend to give away what they do. Because attackers, even though if you understand attacker populations at all, you'll understand that there's a very large amount of criminals out there. And I use criminals very broadly at this point to encompass anyone that's performing malicious cyber activity. And when you look at populations as a whole, there's actually more criminals, throw out a random stat here, than there are in the state of Texas as people across the world. It's a large pool. Now, many of those aren't doing necessarily the cyber operations that we worry about as defenders for companies or for enterprises or for as MSPs or MSPs trying to service other companies, but many of them do. In fact, 30–40% of that large population is focused just on that. And if you break that down, you realize that none of them are stovepipe from each other. When we talk darknet later, this will really come out. They actually rely on each other just like we rely on each other when we live and do our work. You know, where you shop, as an example, if I could throw one out real quickly, matters in the sense that you go to someplace local because it's convenient. Sometimes you go to Amazon because it's equally convenient. And the choice you make is really determined by internal factors and some external ones. Like a lot of us switched over to Amazon and other similar deliveries when COVID-19 happened, right? We had no choice because local access was not as easy or safe. So attackers have the same kind of breakdown. They may have the ability to perform all the reconnaissance of the world. They might be, let's say, nation state sized and resourced. But if there is a pile of data already accessible, if there's a service that captures everything for them, if there's data out there that already exists, why would they go recollect it when they could just grab it for a small price? And you'll see that's where the darknet side really starts factoring in. So we look at that and gauge interest by seeing activity in those areas. Did they buy data? Did they take a recon service? Did they buy a phishing campaign or perform ransomware as a service to gather information? Did they build infrastructure? All those things help us gauge that kind of index. And we look at everything. I could delve into recon types, but I'll just touch on one. One of the key ones that happens frequently is kind of a like-to-like reconnaissance. And this is where, just like you would in marketing, you try to understand my target uses this presence, who is like them around, because they're competitors. But when you have competitors or similar agencies, there will be relationships between the two of them. And it becomes a way for them to move laterally into a target. So guys, there's a lot I could talk about here, but I'll go ahead and pause. You know, I love this topic.
I can tell you're very passionate about it. So alongside the data that you are indexing to try and gauge attacker interest, it seems like you've talked a lot about escalation paths in our prior conversations. So help us understand what an escalation path is and why that's of particular interest to you.
Absolutely. Happy to do so. So those concept chunks that I just described, from planning on to operational activity, those are actually part of an escalation path. So at a planning level, there's very low amounts of time and very low amounts of risk to you if you've been chosen as a target during their planning phase. But as they move into reconnaissance and then into build and putting infrastructure together and testing operational activity against you, there's a curve that rises very sharply afterwards as that momentum is gathered and they get over different hurdles to determine if they're actually going to perform an attack. And that's why escalation is really important. And we gauge that by, again, looking at infrastructure that gets built. So if you have observed how attacks happen in the past, infrastructure doesn't happen the same day that the attack happens in the majority of cases. There's a buildup where time is spent acquiring, setting up, building everything and putting it in place, and then executing an operation. And for the ones that have a keen eye on operational security, they will tear that down and clean up behind themselves. Thankfully, that's a minority, and we have insight into their activities. And thankfully, defenders are able to, disrupt their activities frequently enough that it breaks sometimes the cleaning cycle for them. And so we see this, and the nice thing about visualizing that and understanding that index of interest, especially when you keep an eye on the darknet side of things, is you can see it before it begins. And that's kind of a key hallmark. You're getting an over-the-horizon view, if I could pull on an old Navy term here. So, guys, there's a lot to do there. I mean, there's a lot, on our side, especially as defenders, being able to see things up front, getting an over-the-horizon view allows us to become really, really proactive and be disruptive to them and kind of, again, drive down value by making it really costly for them to attack us.
Got it. Yeah, and I'm really interested to understand how you can see over the horizon. And I know that's what we're getting into, but I'm kind of on the edge of my seat for everybody else. So let's dig further into this concept of the dark web. The concept of the dark web, the deep web, and then also how the information there will lead to insights and actual intelligence. So, I've heard of the dark web and the deep web, but I'm sure that that's not the only way that it's stratified. There's got to be more layers to that. So can you explain what kinds of layers we might see that are below the surface web?
Absolutely, happy to do so. So this view here with the iceberg is a very classic view, and it was born out of how the internet grew up. And indeed, in the beginning, this was fairly representative of what was going on. But as time has went on, especially in the last couple of decades, it is correct, but it's bigger as well. There's a bigger iceberg there. So I'll cover the three real quick, and I'll talk about why dark web is kind of a bigger slice than you might think. So surface web, if I could put an easy definition for surface web, it's what you can readily find in your browser, either through a search engine or by directly going to it, right? It's very visible. It's also known as the clear net in many cases, though those aren't completely synonymous. Deep web is data that's derived. So if you think about it, if you go and look up records and they're pulling records out of a database, or they exist behind a single barrier of some kind, I've got to log into a forum, or there's millions of pages on Amazon, you don't see them all at once. You can't necessarily navigate to each one directly. It's kind of considered deep web data at that point. It's not just readily grabbable. You have to go through some process to get to it. And dark web is really a reference to a subset of the internet where there's barriers to get in. And also we imply by saying it that it is home to activities that would not be present on either the surface web or the deep web. And you'll see there's some nuance to that. For me, though, I kind of break the definition up a little more, because as time went on, as I mentioned in the beginning, we've kind of added more things. Like we have decentralized networks that don't use traditional DNS. And criminals and folks who want to be anonymous, they use those. They hide behind them, and they also place things there, depending on their country or where they live, and thinking they want to elude detection. If you think about it, there's some similarities there between someone who lives in a very repressive regime that wants to still communicate out. They have to go through some of the same steps a criminal would go through in order to hide. And so they kind of share technology back and forth. But really, darknet, I want you to conceptually understand, includes not only the onion router or Tor, onion links, however folks know them well, but also like the Internet Invisible project, which is another kind of darknet in its own, the decentralized networks that are under ZeroNet and the CoinNets. So they use various blockchain technology and coin-based blockchain to kind of perform their DNS activity. And then kind of a laundry list of things that you might think are traditionally on the ClearNet, as well as chat channels from Telegram, Wicker, Discord, and so on. All those are kind of like the darknet. So when you asked me earlier about how can you see things, how can you look over the horizon, really it depends on understanding where people are talking, because the key thing that I think gets forgotten is that they're people. Criminals are still people, and they have needs like people. They have social networks, they have chat things, they want to talk, they want to share, they want to interact. And when they do that, they open themselves up for us to make observations. So I get really into this, so I'll pause right there. Just know that there's many layers there, guy.
It seems really well architected, or at least there is an architecture to it. It seems organized, but it also seems, to me, for somebody that doesn't go there, it seems really unclear how any of this would get built or managed. So who's not only going to these sites, but who's maintaining all this infrastructure?
The same people that are maintaining infrastructure on the internet, period. I mean, when you go to Amazon, there are administrators there that make sure Amazon functions. When you go to Google, same thing. You go to smaller sites, just like there is the ability to create, a complete website on WordPress with very little effort. The same thing exists in like the Onion Router network. So you can go to Tor and do something similar. You can download software and set up your own hidden service and make something visible that is only accessible through the Onion Router, or the same thing on ITP, which is kind of a decentralized version. I didn't mention BraveNet earlier, but it's another one. It's kind of a broad way. I mean, the key thing is criminals use it as well as other folks. I mean, anybody could have a presence there, and you have kind of a mix of speaking to who. a mix of people that are there because it's cool, they think it is, or they're there because they're in a repressive area and that's how they can talk out and reach out to other people, or they're there because they're criminals and they're trying to conduct business of some fashion, or they're offering a product.
Got it. Well, besides stolen credential dumps and stolen data that's available for sale on the dark web, what else should companies generally, and really for our audience today, managed service providers and managed security service providers, what should they be specifically concerned about regarding the dark web?
Okay, so 2 questions there. So what's out there? Just about anything. I mean, that's too broad to just leave it there, but we know data, we know passwords, we know credentials because people tell us about that all the time. But intellectual property, source code, insiders, cell phone numbers, which is kind of like your second social security number. If I have your cell number, I can do many, many things, from take over your phone to use it as an attack platform in other places, right? It's very common. It takes a little effort, and it's not your run-of-the-mill, but it's definitely doable. Information and breakouts of internal organization on companies, malware, of course, phishing, of course, all the ways to build that, and of course, all the other heinous things that go with, criminal activity on the drug side and on extortion and so forth. All that's there, as well as tons of disinformation, amplifying talks to amplify like political narratives. All that kind of exists out there. And so the other part of what you ask is, what can we do about it? So that over the horizon view is seeing relevant things, relevant to you in that space. It's another way to put a sensor out there, which is how we talk about over the horizon. You're putting a sensor beyond your network wall, beyond your client's networks. And all its job is to perform for you, is to find information that's relevant to you. Did someone touch our infrastructure, which happens all the time, right? We get scanned, everybody's checking ports, they're looking for vulnerabilities, and that's fine. That goes somewhere though. Every time that happens, and it's an organized effort, there's a service behind that typically, and they archive that and they sell it, often for 99 cents, $2, $5, whatever. It depends on the type of infrastructure reconnaissance done. When that's tapped, when somebody buys that, that's interesting. That's where your over the horizon sensor would pick that up. If that happened to be one customer of yours out of, say, thousands, that's one thing. If it's a cluster of like 600 of them, now it's very, very interesting, because that shows a nexus of understanding of attacker interest in you as an MSP or an MSSP. It also shows interest in your customers. So, I mean, plenty of examples there. I can kind of go on for a while.
So what would you say is one or maybe 2 things that we're not getting from traditional media or from the cybersecurity vendors when they're talking to the broader market about the dark web?
So 2 words: planning and recon. The enemy's planning and recon. They don't talk about those impacts. They really talk about things in an after-the-fact sense. If you think about it, you get a list of you get a feed, or you get a list of IPs or hashes or whatever. All those constitute things that already happened. The key thing you gain from having an over-the-horizon sensor, having insight into darknet areas, is the ability to be preemptive, to actually take action before things happen. And it's the hardest thing to measure. And I'll give you a real-world example really quick. If you remember, after post 9/11, the FBI had come out before Congress a couple years later and said, yes, we disrupted and stopped 50-some operations that had equivalent impact. And there was it was really tough for everybody to swallow, because there was no evidence, right? It was so preemptive that it was very difficult to measure. And that's kind of this space. If you can see a phishing campaign coming that's going to hit, let's say, half of your customer base, then you disrupt it. Your customers never see that, but smart thing is you show your sensor data so you can prove it. I mean, that right there, that insight, that seeing things in the planning reconnaissance phase is the key part, because you see their planning steps. And again, if you drive the value down, right, their value and you down, they don't attack you. They pivot and move on.
Got it. So in part of that answer, you mentioned threat intelligence, and it's something that's already happened. So let's talk about some of the dark web intelligence sources and your thoughts on, how they get that kind of information and how it can possibly be used.
Sure. Kind of happy to talk about it. I know our own kind of capability best, so I'll probably stick to that. You've listed a few up there on the slide. Those are other excellent companies that provide like darknet intelligence. We're kind of a little different. You know, we don't necessarily pull from like standard sources because of the way the darknet is kind of stratified and broken down. Like we have a heavy monitoring in different areas where people go congregate, and that's important. So again, I tried to allude earlier that criminals are people and they have this need to socialize. And in that socialization is how you kind of figure out a lot of side chatter. From their side chatter, you figure out a lot of what they're doing and what they have done. And so that helps us derive information that we can pipe into companies to take defensive actions. And it's not just chatter. It's whatever, you know, it's everything from their positioning. Again, that kind of plan and recon and infrastructure build section is important. If I'm looking and at several profiles that I know are interested in you, for example, instead of saying, hey, they're going to deploy XYZ malware and tell you that, okay, here's a bunch of IPs they used in the past, you should block those too, I'll watch them. And when I see them make an acquisition, let's say in Baguette.com, which is a Russian set of IP ranges that's very commonly abused by a couple of our service providers we monitor, then we can help you understand what to block even before they begin. And that's kind of a different kind of intelligence. You know, normally when you get an intelligence feed in or you get intelligence sourcing, you either get a report or you get a digest. Your digest is usually indicator driven, and that's really not meant for humans. It's really meant for devices, and that's appropriate. The reporting is more for your analysts, for you to understand what's going on, but often it's either too high level or it's just not a good fit to you because it doesn't understand your infrastructure.
So you're really drawing a distinction between, you know, services that gather information passively. You know, they're out on the dark web, they're screen scraping, or they're, you know, doing some sort of automated data gathering, which can be valuable and can be applied to your infrastructure. But what you're talking about, and I think what cyber defense is, one of your specialties is in that investigative technique and approach to the dark web. So, you know, I think you've alluded to some of your techniques and your tactics. Is there anything else that you'd like to maybe highlight on, and some of the things that you're doing that's just not part of a dark web intelligence source, or, you know, not commonly understood from people that don't operate in the dark web?
Okay, Guy. Yeah, definitely. So there's obviously a line of what I can disclose as far as how we do things, but I'll be as clear as I can and go as deep as I can. I kind of talked about a couple of them. You know, really understanding where to observe and what to do with the observation you gain is a key part of what works for us well. Obviously, having access to the right areas is very, very critical. So I want to make, I want to talk about something most people might know. So most people have an alarm system in their house or have had one in the past. And a lot of times you get the alarm system, you're like, I've got sensors on my windows, I've got, you know, I've got an area that will chime when someone opens the door, if somebody breaks the window, you know, if I alarm it, you know, it'll alert me and might call the police or take other actions. And you feel very content in that. And that's how a lot of our security posture runs. When you gain like some access to something like Deep Insight and you get more over horizon view, now all of a sudden you're put in a mesh network of everybody else who shares the same kind of alarm system around you. And now all of a sudden when they see activity, you kind of gain insight into what's going on and you kind of get alerting. Now that still describes a lot of traditional security tools like us or security intelligence efforts that provide the same thing. What starts changing for us is we not only have that in place, but we also have sensors on where the criminals go to talk about which house they're going to break into in the first place. So at this point, we're kind of looking over their shoulders. They're drawing a map of your neighborhood going, this house looks like it's got a lot of valuables in it. Let's go ahead and break in there. And I've got a buyer that would buy everything I can see through the window. And so seeing that in that planning phase or in that reconnaissance phase when they're casing out an area, that's where we kind of specialize. That's a very investigative kind of tool set that we use to do so. So you mentioned you mentioned scraping and kind of crawling for data. Sure, passive collection is part of it. But again, I'm a big fan of not repeating work, and there's hundreds of services that do that. You can take advantage of that, especially in ways people don't expect. Like there's hundreds of web crawlers that are legitimately used by everybody from Google on and so on. We know them as bots. They hit our networks and they hit our perimeters all the time, and they gather data. Well, that data gets resold. I mean, just about everything, every commercial service you think of, they resell data. And so they make that available. If you put that together, you get another comprehensive view. So we layer, which is probably the second thing I would talk about. Not only in a mesh network and we have insight into planning and recon phases, but we layer our information, kind of like how we layer when we detect theft devices in different locations. And that layering helps us get a very, very accurate picture at times, most times actually, of what's going on as it's leading up to an event. And when we can't get it before the event, we see it during the event, definitely.
It seems to me like what you've been describing is your deep instinct, dark web intelligence offerings. And, it's taking advantage of the passive intelligence sources that you have access to, as well as your active, I guess I would say personalized approach to investigating and reconnaissance on the dark web. I'm assuming that you're making this kind of service available to your, governmental level, federal, state, customers, but are you also making that available to commercial and enterprise and maybe even, MSPs or MSSPs?
Yes, we do. Anybody that approaches us, we do offer this service. It's tailored a lot. So whether you're a state or a municipality, obviously it's a little different if you're a company. If you're a small or mid-sized one, we take a different view. The techniques don't change. The scope in which we need to understand you changes. So I was trained as a profiler a long time ago, and I profile companies, not people, and organizations. That was my specialty. So one of the things we do, like as a first stage activity, is we understand you as well as we can. And we understand you as well as possible, and in ways not only internally for us so that we can take and have good insights, but also in ways that we know the attacker will go and perform their reconnaissance around. So knowing how they gather data, the psychology of the attacker is kind of important. Like, where do they go? How do they gather it? What's their common interest points? And there's a lot of variance there, but understanding you and understanding them allows us to know how those two will meet. And that's kind of a hallmark of our deep insight piece here. If you're a state, you're huge. If you're national, you're gigantic. But if you're a state on down, you're a consumable entity that we could actually help. If you're smaller, easier, your profile's a little gentler for us to put together and do over-the-horizon censoring for.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. It's been very, very helpful to understand, at least a little, going further than scratching the surface on the dark web and what's possible for us as practitioners to do on behalf of our customers. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the difference between traditional threat intelligence and then dark web intelligence. I think there's a couple of really interesting differences here. And so I'm just going to turn you loose to kind of talk through each of these points, and then we'll start talking about on the next slide how we take advantage of this intelligence, whether it's threat intel or dark web intel, into our operations. So first, let's compare and contrast.
Okay, happy to do so. I'll just run down this table for us. So on the threat intelligence side, sourced by, it's kind of critical. If you look at those three that we've got as examples, honeypots, malware analysis, AV, all those are absolutely passive. Absolutely, they're all after the fact. That's not a bad thing. That's an important component, but it should not be your entire defensive posturing. That's why when we look at the darknet side, the dark web side, we're looking at observations. We're seeing what's going on. That always translates into elements that you can use in your security program, but it doesn't translate to simple digestible indicators that would go to your SOC. That might be observations that would go to your SOC head and also your CISO or CIO to help make decisions. Because sometimes the best defense there from observations we make is for you to make a small policy change. Like you make a change to, requiring two-factor authentication before you access certain assets. That's not an indicator kind of decision or an indicator-driven decision. For example, that's something that is born out of observations of risk and of attacks that might be leveraged against it potentially in real time that would drive that. Same thing for focus, and I kind of mentioned IOCs or indicators of compromise. just as a personal pet peeve, it's actually just indicators. You have indicators of activity, you have indicators of reconnaissance, you have indicators of everything. IOCs is kind of a historical artifact of how we reference indicators generally. And then when you contrast that to dark web intelligence, it really gives you more insight into how the enemy is structured, how they plan, how they put things together. So knowing how they perform reconnaissance, for example, tells you their interest. Again, and you can use that as a gauge of, maybe I have a heightened security posture for the next 30 days because I know I'm in their scrutiny, I'm under their observation. And if I make us look difficult to break into, they will move somewhere else because time is money. Structure 4, again, indicators are awesome for a SIM, awesome for IDS, awesome for other security tools, not so great for humans. If I gave you, a list of 1,000 hashes as a person, you're automatically going to go somewhere else to do something with the data. And you're going to try to understand it. You're going to have to reframe it and create a wire diagram of how it connects and how it would connect to your security posture and how you've broken out your security. Versus dark web intelligence, it's going to be a series of observations and talking about their planning and movements. And it's going to be presented in a different format. It won't be a digest style like that. It'll be actually broken out, usually with imagery to help you understand how it links back to you. That means that it helps you do better informed decisions. Scale, threat intelligence, massive data, right? Constantly updated. We make a lot of noise on the threat intelligence side because there's a lot of passive activity going on. The key difference between it and darknet intelligence is our intelligence is about you only, which makes it very, very easy to digest because it's much, much smaller in volume. And it's also incredibly relevant that way. Uses, they're pretty identical. So in many ways, threat intelligence really focuses on detection. Again, it's kind of passive or after the fact data, so it's going to be reactive. You're going to use it to stop things that you know have already happened or activities that you've already been able to break down. And that's very useful and necessary. So but please don't take this as you can have one without the other. You really do need to layer both on. And dark web intelligence kind of contrasts there by since you're seeing it before it happens many times, it's going to be very proactive in nature. And a lot of times you can head things off very, very easily. And finally, that application piece there. With threat intelligence, you have many aspects that you have to feed this into. So if you have a threat hunting group or threat hunting capacity inside, they get fed this information. It goes to your SOC, it gets put in your SIM, gets put in all your tools. You have to do monitoring and update things across all your endpoints. From the dark web side, a lot of times almost every time actually, the reporting there and the observations is really going to go towards decision makers and help them make better informed decisions on when to act. And it's also going to go to like your incident response team. So it's more than just a strategic level. A lot of times when there's a short-term turnaround, like we see something and they're spinning up what we call a raid where they just do a pile on, 30, 40, 50, 60 people across the world will pile on to like a Discord channel or a Telegram or Wicker channel and talk about attacking a company that they pull out of their hat. That's a raid. And it's pulled from, MMORPGs and the same kind of concept, and they'll attack a company. That's a type of attack that's very short fuse. Alerting like that wouldn't necessarily be strategic in level. That'd be something we would report to your SOC. You would engage your incident response and appropriate tools, and you would take action, and then we'd start backfilling on the dark web side. I'm going to pause again, or I'm just going to keep chattering. You know me, I like this stuff. So,
well, there's a ton of information here, and what I find interesting. I mean, obviously, Maturian is coming from the SIM SOC perspective, and so we rely heavily on threat intelligence. And as you said, that's important, but it requires a massive amount of data. It requires tools that have the intelligence to interpret and frame and extract intelligence out of that. And then the SOC can do something with that. And it's really focusing on detecting stuff that's already happened in your environment. The dark web stuff, when done well, as you guys do, is more proactive in nature, more reconnaissance and intelligence focused, and affects policy or should affect policy most of the time. So let's talk a little bit about how we take advantage of this, both threat intel and dark web intel in your SOC. And what we have found, while SIM is a common talking point generally in technology and has gotten a lot of play within the MSP space. I know all of our MSSP partners leverage a SIM, whether it's our SIM or somebody else's, but it's increasingly common for MSPs to leverage a SIM. But still, most of the end user customers are not taking advantage of a SIM platform or even a threat intelligence platform today. And of those end users that are taking advantage of SIM, a lot of times they're trying to manage cost, and they'll only monitor a firewall and a handful of servers. They're not monitoring every point in their infrastructure. Taking the either land and expand role, or I'm just going to monitor critical assets because that's where I've got my that's the amount of budget that I've got. So can you speak to the efficacy of that strategy around threat intelligence and SIM services before we jump into some of the applications of dark web related to the SOC? Is a SIM important to companies of all sizes? And for those companies that are using it, is it important to just focus on the critical assets, or is there value in applying that SIM across their infrastructure?
There's a whole bundle of good questions in there. So you're going to have to interrupt me as I keep going. So, no, that's awesome. I'll go down them. So if I forget one, please prod me again, because I might as I get into things. So I do want to say, I need to step back just 1 second and explain a couple things. And my wife gets on me when I say couple. I might mean a few. So I'll try to be clear on the number here. First thing is, from attackers' perspective, nobody's too small to attack. So I want to start with that, because that is often a common response that we get when we talk security. They're like, no, we're too small. No one would be interested in us. We only do X, right? They either isolate out their size, or they isolate out their activity as being something that would be uninteresting. And what I want to remind everyone who might be thinking that is, you're probably familiar with the concept of 7 degrees of separation. I know Kevin Bacon kind of really popularized it, but it was preceded him. Just look it up. You'll see quickly that it did. Anyway, the point is still relevant. That means that everybody's connected to everybody else. And there's usually a series of steps in between you, but you can trace just about anybody in the world up to 7 degrees away, 7 steps away. So if you think about that in relation to the idea that, okay, I'm too small or I'm not interesting, it's not true. It's not true at all, because from you, I can get to someone who might be able to get me to my target. And attackers do think that way. Your organized attackers, especially. You'll note that I'll say disorganized and organized. So disorganized, chaotic. They don't necessarily put a lot of planning and thought. That planning cycle is very short. They choose almost opportunistically, right, something that's available and in front of them as their attack. Their choice of an attack. Somebody that's organized, they go through a more series of steps. Their planning is much more delineated, and they'll have a better view into how they want to approach you. They will come in laterally. They'll come in through your supply chain. And when you're someone that is part of the supply chain or is lateral, you become the target first. And that's part of the operational testing portion of that escalation path I was discussing. And so keeping that in mind, if you get to a certain size, right, you absolutely need a nerve center in order to understand and keep track of all the security steps you're making. Even if you're not consciously making them, you're making security decisions. The choice to harden your API against abuse is a security decision. Your choice to allow remote workers, and putting monitoring on that, or understanding and limiting it, those are security decisions. Or just everybody has to be in the office to work. All those fit into there. And so a SIM, or Security Operations Center, and a SIM both fulfill that role. So as a department, Security Operations Center is your nerve center, and you need it at a certain size, especially because you get so complex. You absolutely have to have an area that you can go to as a leader and say, am I safe? Am I defended? Can I keep the intellectual property I'm creating, in my hands, not in everybody else's hands? Can I prevent somebody abusing my infrastructure to attack somebody else? And all those other questions that would start arising. Can I keep the data that I create in servicing my customers inside my house? Or does it get taken somewhere else, and then I take a very large hit reputation-wise when it gets disclosed? All those things where a SOC helps control that. And you can name it however you want. There's plenty of names for Security Operations Centers. Same thing for your advisor. They help put the strategic kind of view on top of things. That's another layer that's critical. especially as you gain size. Now, a SIM is important from a technical perspective because it ties all your different security devices together. Because its job is to unify all your incidents and events into one place and allow you to manage them. And having one is critical. And having it fed by that vetted threat intelligence feeds is another critical piece of that. Because you can't see everything from just your perimeter. You can look in and you can look right outside the walls of your network, but you need more insight. So threat intelligence came about as an attempt to provide that. It's kind of like one of the earliest phases of over the horizon view. The concept there was, hey, somebody else had this problem. You might have the same problem too. Let me share that with you. And there are both private and public ones. The problem is they are noisy. They're full of things that are unrelevant. And you need to get rid of that irrelevant information if you can. That's why vetting them up front is important. You know, getting things outside of your market slice may not be as important to you as making sure you focus in. If you're like an ICNS company, you want that kind of information flowing to you as problems. Just stop.
So
pause and take a breath, guys.
I think that's really, I mean, insightful. And just one clarifying question, you know, there's so much volume with threat intelligence that, you know, we as a SIM provider have standardized or made the industry standards of sticks and taxi as an import mechanism available to our products. So that's, you know, default on our platform. But does that approach of importation of data in an automated fashion really apply to dark web intel?
Yes and no. I mean, so yes and no. In some cases where we do create data that should be ingested by a machine, because there are instances where we do, say we outline, you know, several of so there's only about 1,000 or so phishing templates that are mainstream. And then there are unique ones that are very specific to attackers. But there's kind of this shared corpus of phishing kits. And if you're not familiar with a phishing kit, it's a kind of template for how you can create a phishing site and the email and have it delivered and have the stolen credentials or data sent back to you as the attacker. And a lot of times they're bought, or there's hundreds of them that are for free. You know, that's something that can be sent. That corpus doesn't change that often, excuse me. And that's something that is easily digestible by a machine and should be. And there's elements in there that can be pulled out and are represented well, for example, in a SIM platform. You know, that's something where, from the darknet side, absolutely, you would benefit from having it piped into a SIM, and it would be useful. The other observations that really require human insight and intellect to understand, you need the gray matter there, not so much. But so there's a balance, absolutely.
Got it. Cool. Well, as we near the end of our time here, I really want to try and make this, you know, this kind of theoretical conversation a little bit more real, more of an application. And you've got a couple of examples where you're able to talk about how you were able to help somebody, or you're able to talk about an incident that's happened that has informed how you're helping other people. So let me kind of turn it over to you. I know that there was one incident related to an MSP that you'd like to talk about, and then we'll get into one around the mid-market size organization.
Sure. Thanks, Guy. I'll be glad to. I'm not going to name names, though. That's not right. But I will talk in high-level terms with enough detail to hopefully, you know, kind of depict the picture. So we commonly do not only Deep Insight as a monthly service, but we also provide it as a one-time review and assessment of a company to kind of give them a sense of their security posture and the attacker's view into them. When we do those, we always find insights for companies. And in one case, we had done a review of a client, and we were looking at attacker interest and the amount of activity against them and where it was coming from. And we discovered part of that during that review, that their MSP was actually the avenue in. They had lost control of some of their accounts in the remote access tool. And the individuals that had lost control of their accounts, as they moved within that MSP to different clients, the attacks followed along. And as we backtrailed and figured that out, we were able to provide that information not only to the client, but also pass it through and give it to the MSP to allow them to take action. And we figured the very first thing, and I always like to talk about this because people are like, how do you see this? How do you know? The very first thing in that particular instance that keyed us in is we saw site chatter. We have a few people few is a large number. Again, my wife gets on me about accuracy and numbers there. But anyway, this kind of pool of attackers that we watch on a constant basis, because they constitute to us interactive groups that perform the activities against our clients and other folks that we know about. In that chatter, in that side chatter with some of them, we saw a new person come in and start talking about and bragging about what they had done. And that was kind of our key piece. And we went, aha. And as we back trailed through what they had done, followed those profiles, followed what they had bought, followed what services they had used, associations they had with malware in different markets, different locations, that helped us understand that and link it to the MSP and then to our client and kind of to a little broader scale. And that was incredibly valuable because they were spinning up a new attack, and our learning allowed them to engage early to not only shut off the attack against them, but also bring the MSP in and prevent other accidents and future issues that might have occurred from having continued access. And they, of course, went back and contacted the clients that were affected in the past and fixed the avenues in that the attackers had gained.
You know, our MSP communities across the United States are hearing about nation states and just hacker groups that are targeting MSPs as the gateway to their customers. So that's a real personal example to most, if not all, of the people that are with us today. Let's talk about one more example that maybe would apply to, instead of the MSP, one of the MSP's customers. And you've got a mid-market organization example you'd like to talk about.
Absolutely. Again, kind of born out of an intelligence assessment. They wanted they were a robotics company that had a lot of intellectual property, and they had concerns based on some activity they had looked at. So they engaged us to kind of do an assessment on, where do they stand? Is there data out there that had been taken from them, especially around their intellectual property? And so we kind of engaged our investigative capacity, profiled their company, looked for them. And just as a thumbnail about that, when we understand a company and we profile them, we look at everything that an attacker might have insight into publicly. And we do things like go through your website, not only, hash out chunks of code and hash that and use that as ways to do checks. We do the same thing for imagery. We kind of build a brand presence on what might be abused on the attacker side. And we kind of use that to start some of our searching. Just to talk about that for a second, but it was really relevant and why I bring it up, because they had talked and done public disclosures on intellectual property and work they were doing, because it's necessary for their business. And that helped us find issues where, not only the issues they knew, but incredible, additional issues. In fact, in this case, that organization was kind of a hub for other like companies where they came together and share things. And we found that in that sharing, there was one individual, one entity that was passing through a significant volume of their trouble, primarily due to unresolved kind of functional errors in how they were storing their data and some key insertion of malicious code. For us, we found it by backtrailing from their public disclosures all the way through the interest we saw on the attacker side to the malicious code to sales of data and intellectual property. And then having insight in there and talking with them, understanding their past activity in their company, we were able to break down when they actually were breached and get the attack detailed out so that they could take more appropriate action. And they were really awesome in that they wanted to be more proactive. So they left the door open to entice the attackers to come back in so that they could invite law enforcement to observe them breaking in. And it turned out to be very, very useful for them.
Well, they probably wouldn't have known if you'd not been able to do that kind of real-time live research and reconnaissance. I could sit and
Absolutely.
listen to these stories all day long. I mean, you're a wealth of information, and I think every time we talk, I learn more about what is needed from a proactive kind of preventative perspective, both from detection and response to what we do. Looking over the horizon, as you say. So what we've done together as a reward for those that have attended today's discussion, we've got a drawing. We're going to give away 5 of your deep insight snapshots. And so I'll let you talk a little bit about what is included in that, and then we'll turn it back over to Graham to talk about the mechanics and kind of wrap it up and turn it over to Q&A.
Awesome, Guy. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. It's not the full deep dive, but we do look at a couple of the top level items that really have great response, especially for companies It's also areas that they can take immediate action on if we discover something there to talk to them about. So you'll see a couple of things that are listed out there: possible hidden malware, botnets. So we have a presence in areas where that kind of data is reported back, and so we can see slices of data from their own logs and stuff like that. That gives us great insight. We're not alone in that, but we kind of layer it with other things. The hidden malware piece, it can be a lot of things. It could be that someone's selling an account into servers. It could be that someone has 2FA tokens and things like that. If we discover that kind of information, we disclose that in this kind of view. And we also look at the reputational activity. So it may surprise a few folks, but just like we kind of pay attention to the reputation of the people we work with, and we kind of rack and stack, like I like this company over that company, and we have reasons why. So do attackers on the criminal side of things. And I'm using criminal very widely here. On the attacker side is probably more appropriate. They do as well, and they discuss that, and we pay attention to that. So if we see your name in there, or we see attribution to you, we'll create proper right prints for your company. It's part of the profiling piece. If you're not familiar with right print, that's all the little ways that your company might be referred to in, say, text on a website or in just vocal chatter. And it helps us understand when the people are making references. That's all the nicknames and stuff you might create for a company.
Instead of footprint
or
right
a person.
print.
Yeah, right print is specific for like texting or anything written, which if you think about the darknet and how we observe it, that's the majority of it, though there's plenty of vocal interactions that we capture as well. And so you kind of get that all together in this particular view. And you'll get a brief report from us in like a 30-minute review session where we'll walk you through it and help you understand it. Our goal is to give you information that you could use and take advantage of immediately, whether that's making a security posture change, maybe you need to change the coverage of your security devices or something like that. We always provide a roadmap with anything that we bring up. So we'll tell you the problem and what we think a good solution would be. It's kind of that's one thing that makes our reports a little different. We don't just tell you the bad news. We tell you what we think you could do to fix it too. We're often off a little bit because we don't understand you as well as you understand yourself unless we service you directly. But then that's why that's an interactive kind of session, and kind of leave it at that. And if you're interested in something broader, of course, you just have a discussion with us.
That's great. I'm really excited for our attendees to get an insight into your product, deep insight, and what you guys do. So appreciate y'all offering that up as a benefit to people to hear today's discussion. So let's turn it back over to Graham. Graham, talk to us about timelines for when these drawings are going to be done, and we can open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, so Monty, thanks for detailing the Deep Insight snapshot, and many thanks to CyberSenses for a very gracious offer. As covered, we'll be running a random drawing today once we have the full registration and attendee list, and we'll be reaching out next week alongside the follow-up material for the winning 5 organizations, detailing the offer in a little more clarity with the actual outcomes, what's required of an organization to engage, and from there, really excited that some organizations are going to get to work with cyber defenses and see what dark web intelligence can provide their company. So with that, we do have a little time for Q&A. We are at top of the hour, so we'll try to keep this short. For our attendees who are still with us, please do submit any last questions. We've got a few to start with, but we will take a few additional ones. So for our first question, Stuart was curious about a little more information around lateral movement between organizations. It's been discussed a few times, and he was curious how frequent does this happen, and just what are maybe some of the common TNTs that bad actors are using for this.
I guess that's a question for me. Let me jump on that. So you can add clarification, please. So lateral movement. When you commonly think lateral movement, you read it in intelligence reporting. They're talking about internal network lateral movement. Like I'm inside, I get access to a computer, and then I need to figure out where the thing that I find valuable is. So if you're not clear about that, when attackers get into a company, especially a more complex company, they don't get to land exactly where they want. They often come in at any entrance that they can get access to and land, and then that's that land and expand that the guy was talking about earlier. They get in, they're like, okay, here's where I'm at. I need to get over there. I got to jump a couple of network segments, maybe move through some security devices, that kind of thing. That's internal lateral movement. What I was referencing was external lateral movement, where I see that company A works with company B. My attack that I really want to make is on company B. But I know that the two of you have a VPN to VPN relationship, let's say, because you're a hospital and you have a pharmacy that drops scripts, or you drop scripts to a pharmacy and they have a way to drop back, documentation. That usually constitutes a connection. And so if I want to get into that hospital, usually continue with my example, I might break through the pharmacy to get in. And that would be an example of lateral movement. For more disconnected lateral, it could be as simple as I know that you're connected, let's say as an MSP, to hundreds or thousands of other clients. I might infect you to get to all those clients. I may get to one, I may get to a cluster. You become a lateral attack into them. That can also fall under supply chain. So there's a little bit of gray line there. Lateral typically is meant not immediately connected in the sense that you're not providing a service. So an MSP to a company would be more of a supply chain attack versus a lateral attack. Pull something out of public news just for something to kind of think about. I'm in Texas. If you saw the news in May, the Texas Department of Transportation and our judicial system both got attacked with ransomware. Came out very publicly, and you can read about it. If you think about that in context, if that was not their intended target, what's the lateral target? I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Great, thank you, Monty. We have another question. This one coming in from Sam, who is curious for the small business owners trying to develop their security posture, but faced by tighter budgets. Are there good first steps into gaining more insights about the dark web?
Absolutely. So Sam, I'll just talk to you directly. Especially on the small business side, you probably don't have the budget you want to throw at this. You probably want to throw an enormous budget at it, but of course there's real world decisions that kind of build into that. But the number one thing you can do is gain more information, understand what risks are out there to you from any source, whether it's the darknet side or some of the more traditional paths. The number one thing you can do there is understand it, because you might realize that a couple policy decisions on your side can really increase your security posture tremendously. So things like that are just educational driven. You can grab those fairly quickly. A lot of companies provide them. We provide them, so you can connect with us, or you can connect with anyone that you're already working with and get information that help you take good first steps and have a great understanding of what could be at risk inside of your company. That's where you have things like high value asset determination done. That's just a process you run. You might know it as crown jewels analysis. That's kind of the commercial name for it. That's knowing what you have that is valuable and how exposed it might be. That's the educational part I'm talking about.
So, Monty, I'd like to jump in and add a little bit of color from our perspective, and that, as an MSP, we're sometimes painted with a broad brush by our customers, and they assume that we're doing everything possible to protect them. And so, and a customer makes budget decisions that really affect how well an MSP can do that job. And so one of the conversations that Shurian is encouraging every MSP to have with their customer is around data ownership and data responsibility. We're encouraging our partners to make sure that their customers understand that the customer owns the data and is responsible for the data. That the MSP is really a policy advisor. What are the risks and what are the options that you have as the data owner to protect that and mitigate those risks? And then once the data owner chooses what to implement, then the MSP is the person to operate and implement that technology. And so, we're encouraging all of our customers to make sure that all of our partners to make sure that their customers understand that the customer owns both the data and the responsibility, and as such needs to be prepared to set the budget based upon the advice and counsel of the MSP on how to protect that data as best as possible. And then, if something happens because the data owner, the customer, didn't apply the appropriate budget, the burden of that is off of the shoulders of the MSP. off my soapbox. Back to you, Graham.
Yeah, we have one more.
Yeah, back to you, Graham.
We have one more question, which was kind of an interest in how hackers are responding to dark web intelligence. Are they reacting? Are you seeing challenges once you've accessed sources? Just a little curious. People are a little curious about how there's this back and forth between the two sides.
Sure. No, great question, actually. The key answer there to your question is, how skilled are you, right, as the analyst? So that's a question for me. Like, how skilled is cyber defenses at doing this? Do attackers notice this when we take these steps? And there's one answer. The answer is yes, especially when we disrupt their operations. Whether they can actually pinpoint who we are in their say social group that gave insight away to what was going on is the key question. That's the skill reference I'm making. So when we're skilled on our side, and we are indeed fairly skilled in this area and have lots of practice, we don't give it away who we are and where we're placed to see everything until it's necessary. But we're more than happy to burn any kind of relationship we have if it means protecting a customer, protecting a client from getting engaged or affected, because at the end of the day, that's the important part, not maintaining my relationship with someone that is working in a criminal nature. That's really on the engagement side. When you're crawling and scraping and you're pulling data, your ability to be skilled at observing and pulling out information is limited. You only can see what you can see. They can detect that on their end and they can counter it. So I'm going to speak to that part of, do they notice, do they take action? Absolutely. So if you're scraping my website and I'm trying to sell credit cards or sell RDP access into servers or SSH tunnels or whatever, and I see you coming in an automated bot fashion, I'll kick you out. And criminals do. They do it all the time. Just like we would not want that scraping our perimeter, they don't want it either. And they tend to be more proactive. Some of them put a paywall in place to make that harder. Some make you look at video or watch or accept certain things to be able to get in. Some require you to pay money to get in. I mean, there's lots of ways they counter that. And they'll dox you, or they'll kick you out, they'll ban you, they'll trash your reputation across multiple other forums or channels and chats where this is engaged. I mean, there's lots of ways they can respond and do. Graham, hopefully I captured all that for him. If anyone needs more, I mean, happy to ask another question and answer it.
Great. Well, at this point, we are out of questions and having gone a little long. I think we're going to sign off here. First, I just want to thank all of our attendees today. And secondly, a huge thanks to Guy and Monty. Fantastic presentation, very thorough overview of the dark web intelligence, and its application for security monitoring.
Thanks, Monty. Appreciate it, sir. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Graham.